right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to cover the 5 stock issues. We talked about them a little bit the other day. We introduced them when we were setting up the debates, but we need to go into them in more detail tonight. The affirmative side begins the debate. The affirmative is required to present a prima facie case, which means that it meets the minimum burden of proof. There are 3 stock issues that the affirmative needs to present to meet their burden of proof. They need a significance claim, an inherency claim, and a solvency claim. You don't have to have every possible significance claim, but you have to have a sufficient significance claim to justify making an argument. Right? It's up to you and your partner to decide what claims you want to present. Right? We're going to start then with the issue of significance. Significance is the justification that the affirmative side has for taking an action. Why do you want to do something? So I want to keep in mind your topics here. I don't know if I wrote them down. I didn't print up a form for us. I'm working from rough notes. I don't think I printed them out. So we got raising the age of military enlistment, lowering the drinking age, ban assault weapons, terminally ill patients, autonomous cars, prostitution, and Common Core. Okay. The significance claim is the reason that you want to change something. So let's suppose that you want to raise the drink or lower the drinking age. That's one of our topics. Why would you want to do that? You have to have a justification for doing it. There has to be some significant reason that would justify lowering the drinking age. You just don't do it randomly for no reason whatsoever. Typically, those arguments are going to fall into one of 3 categories. You have need arguments, you have value-based arguments that are called goals, and you have advantage arguments. Right. All of your topics are likely to have 1 or 2 in each category. You do not have to have an argument in every category. You just need 1 significance claim, regardless of which type it is. All right, we're going to start with need arguments. A need argument is an argument that says, basically, it's a claim of fact. It's a claim of fact that says a problem exists. That's why we need to take this action. Terminally ill people are suffering without any solution to their pain. The Common Core is hurting children's ability to learn effectively. Those are mostly advantages. Oh, prostitutes are being murdered, abused, so on and so forth, because they can't be protected in the existing system. A problem exists. So sometimes your significance claim is an existing problem. We can look at it and say, this is a problem, and that's why we need to take an action. Sometimes we're predicting a problem. We're anticipating something. It hasn't happened yet, but it's about to. I am not too far away from potentially retiring, but I am a ways away from collecting Social Security, but not that far. I have an expectation that I'll be able to get a little bit of Social Security. Are any of you planning on being able to get Social Security when you retire?
No.
How come?
Too much money.
Yeah, well, it's going to go bankrupt before then, because the actuarial tables just don't balance out. Maybe we should do something about that before that happens. You know, that's exactly what we're talking about. You're anticipating a problem, and you're saying that's the thing that justifies us taking an action now, because we can head this problem off before it becomes something that is too difficult for us. Right? Another type of need argument is a disparity argument. A disparity is easy to explain to most college students, especially at the end of the month. You look at your pile of bills, and you look at your bank account. And there's typically a difference between the two. That's a disparity. So if you have $1,500 in bills, but only $1,000 in your bank account, you have a $500 disparity. That's something that you got to fix. If you have 4 papers to write before the end of the term, but you only have 20 hours to write those 4 papers, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble. You know, it's because you've got a shortage of time. It's pretty much You know, that sort of thing. So that would justify doing something. That would justify pulling an all-nighter if you're writing papers. It would justify asking for extra hours at work if you are short, or borrowing money from your parents to pay your bills. Those would be things, you know, because there's a disparity that would justify taking some additional action. All right, so need arguments usually are claims of fact, and you're talking about some problem. A second type of significance are value-based arguments. They are typically goals. It's a claim of value that says what's wrong in the system is some judgment that we're making about morality or fairness, what is just or appropriate, something along those lines. The people who want to lower the drinking age often have an argument based on the notion that there's something unfair about being an adult when it comes to voting, serving in the military, being able to get married, but not being able to have a drink at your wedding, have a bottle of beer after you've killed enemies in the field, or you know, celebrating that your candidate won the election, you know, something like that. And say, oh, that's something that's an injustice in some way. Well, that's a value claim. You're saying there's something wrong there that is an offense to our value system. And so we have an existing value that is underemphasized. We're not giving people appropriate treatment for their adult status in this particular case. Or maybe we have an existing value, but you're arguing that we could enhance that value in some way. We could have more of it if we take some action. It would be better to do that. Here's another typical one. We need to replace the existing value and put it in a different place. The people who are arguing about terminal illness, they often say, extending a person's life is less important than the quality of the life that that person has. And so we should emphasize the quality of life more than the life itself. Well, that's suggesting that we should change what our value priorities are. And that would justify making a change. Is there a topic that we haven't talked about yet? I'm trying to make sure that I give examples in all the categories.
Gun control.
Okay, the Common Core one, for instance, and the gun control one. Okay, gun control is most likely going to be need arguments. That's typically where those arguments are. That we have, you know, mass killings, we have high rates of crime, we have suicides, that sort of thing, and that those are mostly done with guns. That's causing the problem, and that's why we need to control those sorts of things. So that's not that complicated. The Common Core argument might be that you know, there might be a value argument about the way in which teaching is being done. That we're shifting from an emphasis on objective standards to more subjective criteria for teaching, and that's not a good thing. There's something problematic about that. If there was a harm to the way kids learn, that would probably be a need issue. The people who advocated Common Core, when they were on the affirmative side and saying that we should go to this, typically were arguing the third type of significance, which is that there's some advantage to using Common Core. So let's talk about that. Advantages. Advantages are a reason why you would want to do the policy, not because there's a problem so much, or not because there's something wrong, but we could just have something better than we have currently. Right? This is an easy one to explain, I think. How many of you upgrade your phone even though your phone still works? And why do you do that? What's that? It's faster. That's an advantage. That's nice. Your phone would still get you the information that you need, but it's a little bit faster. Any other reasons? It looks cooler. It's nicer. You know, it's sleeker. It's got a little cachet that comes with it. Oh, you got the, you know, iPhone 72. Or whatever that particular issue is, you know, this particular time. Or something along those lines. Typically, advantage arguments say that a new policy would yield some improvement in a factor value. Not something that's a problem so much, but that you're going to have a better camera on your phone, or that sort of thing. I've got an example that I like to use that you will appreciate. It's historically hilarious. When I was in graduate school, actually I was out of graduate school, but I had a friend who was still in graduate school, and he got an early personal computer, a Commodore 64, which allowed you to do word processing and play missile command. That's basically what you could do with it. It came with a dot matrix printer. Right, so it had a little wheel in it, and it printed dots that formed words. Have you ever seen printing like that? That sort of thing. And it printed on paper that came on a reel. So you had perforated holes on the edges, and you rolled the paper into it, it printed on, and then you had to tear the pages apart. He got it, and he was so proud of it, and he was showing off to me, and he says, it will print up to 3 pages a minute. And I remember asking him back in 1983, why would you ever need anything that fast? But of course today, we stand impatiently at most printers wondering why it is our 50-page paper is taking a whole minute to print. You know, that kind of thing. What the heck? Come on, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. Because that's the way we've changed. You know, what was once an advantage may become a necessity. Cell phones, I think, are a good example of that. I put off getting a cell phone as long as I possibly could. It wasn't until I was a pain in everybody else's ass that I got a cell phone. And I didn't pick it. I came home one day and there it was sitting on the bed. My wife and daughter said, that's yours. Put it in your pocket. Because apparently it was complicated that they could not get a hold of me 24/7. Holy criminy. And now of course I'm like everybody else. I'm used to having it. I kind of depend on it for a variety of things. But imagine a world where people didn't get on their phone every second of every day, where they actually, I'm sorry, it's an old man, cranky old guy complaint. I come into my classes, it's absolute silence in class, because nobody's talking to each other, they're all on their damn phones. I used to come into class and people would be visiting with each other, making conversation, they'd ask me questions, we'd talk about your weekend, that kind of stuff. Today it's like, you walk into a classroom, there are 25 people and it's silent. Different world. I'm sure there are enough advantages to overcome the disadvantage of the lack of social interaction that goes on there. So maybe we're going to save some time, save some money, save a little bit of energy, something along those lines. There's it's going to be sleeker, nicer. When people buy a new car, they don't usually buy a new car because their old one stopped working. That's sometimes the case. That's a need argument. I need a car to get from point A to point B. My current car doesn't work, so I have to buy a new car to be able to do that. But if you're just trading in your car to get something that's cooler, faster, thank you. I think there's one more there. Nope, it's not going to show up. Yeah, I think 1 or 2 bless yous or Gesundheits is appropriate. After that, you're just indulging people. You know, so I always tell people, you get 2, and then after that, you have to get well on your own. Thank you for your good wishes. Have you ever had a sneezing jag where you went 11 or 12 sneezes in a row? And it's very frustrating. Imagine how frustrating it is if somebody is in the room with you and they constantly saying, God bless you, God bless you, God bless you, God bless you, God bless you. Stop it. I appreciate your sympathy. All right. Now, that's the affirmative's perspective on significance. They have to have a significance claim in the first affirmative. Responding to those claims is the responsibility typically of the first negative speaker. And your responses are likely to fit into a pretty specific category, direct refutation. This will be just like you did for your refutation speeches. You're going to deny, diminish, and dismiss the claims. You're going to present counterclaims. You're going to challenge the grounds and the warrant that the advocate presented. You're going to suggest that they have left information out. There's other information that shows that this is not as important. There might be a conflict over what is true on a particular issue. And that's perfectly fine. For example, on the issue of pain and suffering for people who are suffering from terminal illness, Is there in fact pain and suffering? Or is that just an assumption of the affirmative side? Because the truth of the matter is that we have a lot of medications to prevent pain for people who have terminal illnesses. Why is anybody suffering when there is opium? If you're going to die in 6 months anyway, help yourself to all the OxyContin that you are happy with. Not enough to kill you, but enough to eliminate whatever pain you have. Why is this an issue for people? There's a dispute about whether or not that is something that really happens. So the negative should be challenging any of those kinds of claims directly. Use the 3Ds, think about the different refutation strategies that we've talked about, and apply them to those particular claims. The second stock issue is the inherency argument. The affirmative has to demonstrate that the harms that they are talking about occur because of the present system. Think of it as a cause-effect claim. The significance claim is the effect. The inherency argument is the cause. What is it in the present system that produces these harms? Why does this exist? Because that's what the affirmative is saying. That's what we're required to change. We have to change the current system because the current system is causing these particular problems. Inherency arguments typically fit into one of two categories. What's called structural inherency, and the other one we'll get to in a second is attitudinal inherency. Structural inherency is pretty much what it sounds like. There is a policy, a rule, a procedure, a structure that creates this particular problem. It's a claim of fact. You're saying this policy requires the harmful action. Of the topics that we're looking at, probably the easiest one to identify is, why is it that the drinking age is at 21? Why can't people who are 18 drink? Because we have a national minimum drinking age act that required the states to put the drinking age at 21. All the states have a 21-year-old drinking age. That's the law. There you go. If the harm occurs because 18-year-olds who are adults supposedly at 18 can't drink, and the reason they can't drink is because of this law, then that's what we need to change to fix the problem. Does that make sense to everybody? All right, Common Core. Why is Common Core there? Well, the states have adopted it as their primary method of educating children. It's a fairly recent innovation. It was the states were incentivized by grants from the federal government, or they did it for themselves in order to kind of improve what they think were the failing elements of their schools, and so they've adopted this system. Not all states use Common Core, but some do, and the ones that do, that's where you need to make a change. If the states aren't using Common Core, then we don't need to get rid of it there. The death penalty is not one of our topics, but this is a pretty straightforward one. If the harm that comes from the death penalty, you want to get rid of the death penalty, if the harm that comes from the death penalty is a value argument that says it's wrong to execute people, then the source of the problem is the existence of the death penalty itself. That's the inherency thing. 31 states in the federal government have a death penalty. Here are the number of people that are sitting on death row and subject to this right now. Here are the number of people who were executed last year as a way of showing us what the existing system is like. But if the source of the problem is that innocent people could be executed, well, is that because the death penalty is there that innocent people get convicted, or do innocent people get convicted for some other reason? You would have to explain what that is and explain why the remedy that you have is the best solution to that problem. Because your significance has to stem from an inherent problem. So we have existing policies that directly create the harm, or maybe that they prevent the implementation of a solution. Do we have the autonomous cars topic in this class? So we were talking about this the other night. Why is it that autonomous cars might have difficulty becoming part of the economic system here? Because state laws require that there be a driver in the automobile. And if there isn't a driver in the automobile, you're violating the laws of the state in operating that vehicle, even though the car supposedly can drive itself. That's a barrier to making those kinds of cars available. If you're sitting in the back seat of an autonomous car, I don't know who gets the ticket, the passenger or whoever owns the car, you know, but definitely if you're in the car and it gets pulled over. By the way, I assume that autonomous cars would respond to the CHP pulling you over. Uh-oh. That's a thing. All right. Or maybe we have a policy to address this issue, but it's flawed in some way. You know, there's something problematic about it. The people who want to raise the age for military enlistment, I've never had this topic before, so I don't know exactly what the issues are there. Obviously, the structural inherency is that that's the minimum requirement, that you have to be 18 to enlist. You can enlist earlier, but you can't actually start serving, I don't think. So like you can enlist when you're 17, but your induction date can't be until you're 18. I think that's what the rule is. I'm not quite sure about that. Having never served, I could not tell you for certain. But that's my belief. Right? But those are the rules. If you say the harm occurs because people are immature, too immature to make a decision when they are 18 about something like that, I would like to have you on the negative side in that alcohol debate, because that would be an interesting contrast. But you know, you're saying that the significance occurs because of this age rule, and that's easy to pick out. Right, a second type of inherency that I mentioned to you before is attitudinal inherency. Attitudinal inherency is based on, well, the source of the problem comes down to people. People are horrible, and they are uncooperative, and they won't do things that are good for them. They won't do things that would make things better around the world, and we've tried to do that, so now we have to do something else that produces this outcome. It's again typically a claim of fact. The source of the problem is that existing attitudes prevent these things from working. Here's a nice historical example. Interesting numbers. Back in the late 1960s, 55,000 people a year died on our nation's highways in car accidents each year. As many people died on our nation's highways as Americans died, I should say, in the whole Vietnam War, every year. And we had 100 million fewer people who were driving than we have now. So we're trying to fix this problem. In 1966, Congress and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration agreed that all new cars sold in the United States will be required to have seat belts for every passenger in the car. A lot of cars had seat belts before then, but it was a requirement in 1966. Right? By the late 70s, we had 56,000 people dying on the nation's highways every year. Because guess what? People wouldn't wear their damn seat belts. The solution's right in front of you. You've heard the saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. There it is. The solution to the nation's highway fatality rate being so high is right there in the car with you, and people won't wear them. We gave them education campaigns, public service announcements, showed them violent videos or films to try and encourage them to do that. We used technology to improve it. We made the seatbelts more comfortable. We added bells and whistles to remind people to wear their seatbelts. Seatbelt usage went from 12% in 1970 to 18% by 1984. Damn those people. And that's when they decided mandatory seatbelt laws were going to be the answer. That's how we're going to fix things. Seatbelt use now is above 85% in most places. Let me close my eyes and have a show of hands. Is there anybody out there who doesn't wear their seatbelt when they're driving in the car? Do you guys see any hands? You see how many? Two. Okay. So it's pretty high in here. Put your hands down. See, I don't want to judge you as being stupid. But the truth is, most of us have gotten used to this. I mean, when you were little kids, your parents buckled you in. I mean, you can't get out of the hospital without having a car seat. You know, they won't, the hospital will not let you leave if you don't have a car seat for the kid, which requires a seatbelt, you know, that kind of thing. So it's one of those things that is different about the world today. And it's because people wouldn't cooperate. All right? We're not getting cooperation in fixing the problem. And that just happens a lot. Or maybe the enforcement is bad. Using a more contemporary public safety issue related to driving. Texting while driving is dangerous, right? We have hundreds of people who die in accidents every year because of texting while driving. We fixed that problem, right? We made it against the law. So nobody's out there driving and texting at the same time? Yeah. Maybe the source of the problem here is that the enforcement isn't strong enough, and so we need to maybe have, you know, some stronger penalty to do that. I don't know what. You know, death penalty. Which seems like it would be defeating the purpose of the law in the first place. But maybe the fines need to be bigger or something like that. We need to have specific, what I'd like to be able to do. Here's my plan. It would never work. It's not practical, but it's a good plan. Everybody could be equipped with a dart gun. And every time you see somebody driving while they're using their cell phone, you could shoot the dart gun at them and it would stick to their car. And once you've got 3 darts on your car, the cops could just pull you over and give you a ticket for being an ass. Yeah, you could shoot all 3 at once, but maybe they'd have to be different colored darts. You know, we'd have to work this out. You know, somebody else. All right. Now, the negative responses to this, same sort of thing. You can do direct refutation. You can argue that the affirmative hasn't accurately described the present system. They've left out things that are designed to affect this. For instance, on Common Core, the affirmative is saying Common Core is being used as the primary means for teaching, and it's creating problems in the classroom for teachers and students that makes it harder for them to learn. But if teachers have parallel tracks where they can also use traditional means for teaching, and the Common Core hasn't prohibited that, well, that mitigates the need to get rid of Common Core, because that seems to suggest that there is still the ability to do these things. I don't know that that's the case. I'm just giving you a for instance. My earlier class, one of their topics is that we should eliminate tuition for community college students. Did we talk about this in class the other night? Well, this is a pretty good example because I think it's perfect for, in California, when people say, oh, you know, tuition for community college students keeps people from getting an education because they're poor. Not in the state of California. I teach at Fullerton down in Orange County. I think I've told you that before. 80% of my students have a BOG waiver, a Board of Governors waiver for their fees because of their economic circumstances. They don't pay any fees because they're poor. Why do we need to get rid of the tuition if they're already not paying the tuition? The affirmative has failed to describe what the present system is like accurately in this situation. Now, in other states, it may be different. I don't know. But in California, nobody's kept out of the community colleges because they're poor. The other strategy that you can use as the negative is defense of the present system with minor repairs. Right? A minor repair is an argument that says we could fix the system within the system. It's like if your car breaks down, most of you don't go out and buy a new car. What do? You fix your car. You get the fuel pump replaced, or you get a new tire, or whatever it is that's broken. You take care of that sort of thing instead of buying a new car. Well, maybe we can fix the system, but you have to be able to fix it with elements that already exist. You can't create something new. So, for example, if there were educational programs that are part of Common Core that would address the issues, that would be something that you could use. On the autonomous cars, for instance, if there are experimental programs that would allow them to test these things out on city streets without violating the laws, then let's do those kinds of things. And once the cars become, and the technology gets to be more ubiquitous and easier to use, then we'll talk about this issue. So let's just wait until the time is necessary, something like that. So a minor repair is an attempt to fix the problem without changing the whole system entirely, but just kind of tweaking things. As long as you can do that without having to have a structural change, that's a perfectly legitimate negative strategy. Okay? Pay no attention to that. We're not going to talk about that. All right, our third stock issue is a solvency claim. Solvency is a claim of future fact. You're saying if we do the affirmative plan, this will be the result. We'll have more jobs, safer streets, better educated children, less pain and suffering, greater autonomy, I don't know, whatever our topics are. More fairness for drunk college students, cheaper prostitutes, or safer prostitutes, not necessarily cheaper. Although that might be an advantage that you're working on, I don't know. But you're saying when we do our plan, this is what's going to result. We're going to have this outcome. So it's a claim of future fact. So how do you prove that? Well, first of all, you have to have a plan. What is it that you're going to do? Now, some plans are really simple. They're not going to be anything more than the proposition. If you're going to lower the drinking age to 18, that's simple. If you're going to allow physician-assisted suicide, well, can I get that if I have a hangnail? You know, a little indigestion. Hemorrhoids are pretty bad, a lot of pain and suffering. You know, give me the pills, I'm going to snuff myself. Is that okay? Can I request it for my Alzheimer's-ridden spouse? Do you have any rules that you want to put in place? Any safeguards that you think would be appropriate? If something that you want to do costs money, how are you going to pay for it? You need to have a plan of action. Like I said, some plans are simple, but some would be much more complicated. If you want to replace America's healthcare system with a single payer plan, who's going to pay for it? What are people eligible for? Are there any limits on how much we can spend on something? What are the rules and procedures for getting access to this? What are you going to do with the current medical system? How are people going to be compensated? All that's all stuff that has to be resolved. That's a little hard to do in a 7-minute speech. You couldn't explain the plan, much less the justification for the plan. So sometimes you're going to have to model it on some other action. For example, on the physician-assisted suicide topic, most people who debate this topic simply say, we want to adopt the Oregon model for the Death with Dignity Act. Or we want to use the California proposition, I forget what our number was that allowed people to do it. Who's on that topic? Do you guys know what the California proposition number was? I'll just make up something. Proposition 9. We're going to use California's Proposition 9 and make it the nationwide law. All right? And then you have a policy that's at least outlined, people know what you're talking about, and the grounds will be a little bit clearer as you're talking about it. To show that a plan's going to work, well, you're making a claim of future fact. How do you prove a claim of future fact? We've talked about this to some degree. You might use a chain of reasoning. All right, here's the consequence. If we get rid of Common Core and we go back to what we were doing before, then the things that Common Core was causing a problem with are likely to disappear. And if the past experience was more successful, then we're going to get a more successful outcome. Like if we were talking about the death penalty, this is an easy one. If the harm is innocent people could be executed and you eliminate the death penalty, well, will innocent people be executed anymore? No, because nobody's being executed anymore. That's an easy one. All right, that's simple application of deductive reasoning. Sometimes you're making a chain of inductive reasoning when you're trying to arrive at a conclusion. Often we have prior experience. Do we have the high school exit exam topic in here? Yes, no? Nobody's jumping up and saying yes, so I'm gonna assume no. I guess it's the other class. One of the debates is going to be on restoring the California high school exit exam. Did you guys take the exit exam? It was required, but they recently got rid of it. I don't know how long ago it was that they got rid of it. So that's why I was thinking some of you may have taken it before they got rid of it, and some of you may not have had to take it in order to graduate high school because they'd already gotten rid of that requirement. Well, if we were arguing that issue, we could look at our past experience. When we had the high school exit exam, what benefits did it produce? We could look at that and say that's why we ought to have it back. The assault weapons ban. Right? Do we have any previous experience with an assault weapons ban? So if you're going to argue that we should have an assault weapons ban, let's look back to the law that was in place between 1994 and 2004, see what the results were there, and if they were favorable, we could use that as a significance argument to say, look, you'll get these particular kinds of results. Or maybe you have other countries that have done these kinds of things, and you could use the experience from the other countries to make a comparison. Pilot programs, that has nothing to do with learning how to fly. A few years ago I tried a 9/11 joke. It was not a good idea. You guys are probably too young to remember, but there was one of the things that should have been a warning sign to the FBI and a variety of other people is that we had several of the people who were the 9/11 hijackers were enrolled in flight school, and they were not interested in learning how to land planes, just how to fly them. Somebody should have been, that's a little weird, you know? So I tried a joke based on that idea. It was not good. It's insensitive. And so we're not going to go there. When we're talking about pilot programs, we're saying somebody's tried something at an experimental level, and they're now making an inductive generalization that says we can do it at a wider level. Maybe 4 years ago, 5 years, it's been a while since I heard this debate, but it was actually a pretty good debate, the last one I heard. There was one that wasn't very good, but the one that I remember hearing was pretty good. Single-sex classrooms. Right, so everybody in elementary school and high school, they'd have the same class requirements, but all the girls would be in one classroom and all the guys would be in a different classroom, getting the same material. And there are schools that have tried that and have found that the students perform better, they learn more. There's distractions that are involved when you have a mixed sex classroom. I can't imagine what it is for a 14-year-old boy that might cause him to be distracted in class by his classmates. Or I can't imagine what social patriarchy might exist in a system that keeps women from being able to participate fully in the classroom when, you know, the instructors and all the guys are there. There's a whole bunch of argument about that stuff. So the argument is, if it worked at these schools where we tried it, maybe we should do it statewide or nationwide, and that should be the rule. That's an example of, you know, making an inferential leap from a single example or a narrow example, and, you know, suggest that it works that way. Analogies are also a typical way that people try and demonstrate that a policy could work, because similar policies have worked. Other kinds of things have produced the same kind of outcome. When people were advocating for the Affordable Care Act, does anybody know what the analogy was to? Because it wasn't to Canada, which has a single payer system, and it wasn't to Great Britain, which has a nationalized healthcare system. Does anybody know what the basis of the Affordable Care Act is?
Based on like Massachusetts state.
Well, they had one, but how did they come up with it? It's something we already have in place that requires you to get insurance.
Car insurance?
Car insurance. The model was people who have cars and operate on the road are required to have insurance, and that diffuses the risk, keeps costs low for everybody. As long as everybody's required to participate, then there'll always be coverage, we'll always have enough money, and everybody will be covered. We should do the same thing with healthcare. And that's basically what the argument was when they were developing this system. There have been problems with it, but that's another issue. All right, now, there is one other strategy that the negative can use. Well, first of all, the negative can use direct refutation on those arguments as well. But there's one other strategy I'll mention. I don't want you using it in our debates. But in another life, 10 years from now in your career, it might make perfect sense, and that's a counterplan. What happens with a counterplan is you say, in essence, let's not do what you're suggesting, let's do something completely different. Here's the problem when you have a counterplan. Basically, the negative offers a counterplan. They agree that a problem exists. They agree that the present system can't fix it. But instead of doing X, we should do Y. What happens to presumption and the burden of proof? Well, not necessarily flipped around, because nobody's presumption's based on the existing system. Neither side is defending the existing system anymore. All right? That's a problem. Counterplans also can't do the same topic as the plan. In other words, you can't say, well, instead of banning assault weapons, let's ban all guns. Well, that would be the same thing as banning assault weapons. You're just adding more guns to it. But assault weapons, you basically are advocating the proposition. Now we've got two affirmative teams. Here's another thing. The counterplan needs to be competitive with the plan. In other words, it has to be a reason to vote for the counterplan and not the plan. If you could have both, then the counterplan isn't a reason not to have the affirmative plan also. Let's do both of the things. Let's lower the drinking age and increase the age at which people are allowed to drive. That might be a counterplan, for instance, that you have. Instead of lowering the drinking age, let's just raise the driving age. And the affirmative team says, we can do both. I have no problem with raising the driving age as long as we lower the drinking age. So that's not a reason to, you might be trying to fix a problem by raising the driving age, but if you could do both things, that's not a reason not to lower the drinking age. So no counterplans for our classes. Let's keep your lives simple. Okay? Questions before we move on? We've basically been talking about the responsibility of the first affirmative and the first negative speakers. The second affirmative is going to basically defend the case structure. But there are two other stock issues that we haven't talked about yet, and that's where we need to go next. The negative typically divides up the responsibility for the debate between the case for change, which are the arguments that we were just talking about, and the method of change, the plan that the affirmative wants to put into place. The second negative usually talks about the problems with the plan. Not why the first negative says, here's why we don't need it, and the second negative says, here's why doing it's a bad idea. Do you guys know if you're the first affirmative or the second affirmative yet? If you do, that's great, because the first affirmative has to write a case, but the second affirmative should participate in that process. Do you know who the first negative and the second negative is going to be? If you know that, then you're going to know which arguments you should be developing and which arguments are your partner's arguments. And when you find information, you want to make sure that information that supports your partner's arguments ends up in their hands, and you don't just hoard it because, well, I found it. I want to use it. Purpose is for you to work together to find a coherent strategy that responds to the other side. All right, there are two stock issues that I said remain. These are, the negative is not required to present a case. If the affirmative never presented a prima facie case, the negative would win by default. It's just like in the criminal justice system. If somebody is accused of a crime but there's no evidence presented against them, the case is going to be dismissed. We're not even going to have a debate on it. But we're going to assume that the affirmative is going to present a case that justifies some argument. Now let's talk about what their plan is, and that's where the second negative deals with this. The two stock arguments are workability arguments and disadvantage arguments. Workability arguments are arguments that say the plan will fail to accomplish its objective. It will not solve the need, so it's not going to fix the problem. It will not achieve the goal, so we won't have this improvement in our value system. It will not gain us the advantage that you say it's going to get us. I haven't done the math on it in a while, but I used to hear several arguments, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, about how buying a hybrid vehicle would fail to have any environmental or economic benefit to you. And the primary reason is how long it takes to recover the economic investment, because hybrid vehicles are more expensive than traditional cars, and what the amount of pollution difference is going to be based on those sorts of things. Because you make trade-offs. We will cut down on the amount of fossil fuel, but we're going to have other particulate matter in the atmosphere as a result of the mining that's required to create the batteries and that sort of thing. You're going to save money on gas, but you're going to spend $10,000 out of your pocket first to buy that hybrid vehicle, and it would take the average person, let's say, 7 years to recoup the extra cost of that $10,000 based on the savings on the gas, assuming the price of gas goes up. If the price of gas goes down, then it's going to take you longer to do those things. Those are examples of workability arguments. You think I'm going to buy a hybrid vehicle and save money and save the planet, but if it doesn't do those things, why would you buy the hybrid vehicle? All right. Workability arguments are attempts to diminish the affirmative significance. To say what the justification that the affirmative has for putting in a new policy is flawed, because you're not going to achieve that objective, or at least certainly not as much as you think you're going to get it. Right, the first workability arguments are based on alternate causality. Now, sometimes alternate causality arguments would be made as first negative responses to the solvency argument. So here's the scenario. The affirmative says X causes Y. Y is something that's bad. The present system fails to regulate X. We put in a policy that regulates X, and therefore we'll have less Y, which is the bad thing. But the negative says X either doesn't cause Y, or there are other things that cause Y that you're not going to control, so you're not going to really gain any solution here. Reducing our carbon footprint sounds like a great idea to eliminate the effects of global climate change. But if global climate change is most strongly influenced by activities that have little to do with human beings, and everything to do with geothermal activity, the effectiveness of the oceans as filters, and sunspot activity, the fact that you cut down the amount of gas that you use by half might not make a difference, because if a volcano goes off in the Philippines, you get as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as you would from 10 years of every car on the planet driving. So are you really going to fix the problem? Sometimes the first negative argues those as solvency arguments, but if the first negative doesn't argue them, the second negative could make them as arguments as workability arguments. Workability arguments don't necessarily have to show that the plan will have no effect, but it's a way of chipping away at the significance. Maybe you'll have some effect, but not as much as you think. I didn't read it. I saw an article today. I just saw the headline. Counting calories is not the way to lose weight. Okay, well, if calorie counting doesn't do it, why would I bother doing it? Why would I bother limiting my intake of calories if that's not the thing that's going to affect that? I'm just going to keep eating all the crap that I want. I was glad to hear that. All right. Compliance arguments involve policies where the inherency is attitudinal in nature. In other words, the motivation is people don't want to change. So on the gun control topic, the NRA and others who are opposed to a variety of gun controls have made this argument in the past repeatedly. When guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. Law-abiding people might cooperate with a prohibition on guns, but criminals won't. And criminals are the ones that are the source of the problem. If you can't get them to comply with laws against murder, robbery, and theft, what makes you think they're going to comply with a law that says you can't have a gun? And black markets will flourish and criminals will have guns, and look how well it's worked with drugs. You want to get rid of drugs? How'd that go over? You want to get rid of guns? You think that's going to be any better? There's an argument that says people will simply not comply with the law. Charlton Heston was not the first person to say it, but he said it in a fiery speech at one of the conventions. I think it was the convention right after Columbine, so that's why it got a lot of attention. And it's also been a slogan of many anti-gun control people. They'll get my gun when they pry my cold, dead fingers from around it. What does that tell you?
Revolution.
Yeah. Click, click, come get it. That's what people are saying. They're willing to defy the law and potentially die in order to hold on to that. That's a pretty strong compliance argument. You know, that people do not want to comply with the law. A similar argument is circumvention. That's what happens to Jewish boys the 8th day after they're born. That'll be on the test, write it down. All right. A circumvention argument. Here you go, Ernesto. It's like tax evasion and tax avoidance. The engineers don't always like this joke, but we know Ernesto's an accounting major, so he'll appreciate this. Do you guys know the difference between tax evasion and tax avoidance? 10 years in prison. Tax evasion is a compliance issue. If you hide your income from people and the IRS finds out, you go to jail. Tax avoidance is why you have a tax attorney. So you can avoid paying taxes legally. That's what a circumvention argument is. How do we get around these rules without breaking the rules? Let's find loopholes and other ways that we can do these kinds of things. And that's a very typical, I mean, it happens all the, in San Francisco, they have a ban on Happy Meals. All right, so you can't get a regular Happy Meal in San Francisco with the toy. The Happy Meal has to comply to certain requirements that San Francisco put into place. So the amount of fat has to be so much, the amount of salt in the meal has to be so much. Basically, you can have a cheese sandwich with mustard and wheat bread, 3 apple slices, and non-fat milk. And then we can put a toy in your meal. To me, that sounds like an unhappy meal. All right? And why are they doing this? They're doing this to try and discourage kids from getting in the fast food habit, eating bad food, and they think the toy is incentivizing people to do this. So that's the way they've tried to control this problem. So you know what happens in San Francisco? They just sell the toys separately. So when you buy the Happy Meal, would you like to toss in the toy for an extra 10 cents? Yes. There you go. Suddenly your law doesn't work very well. Right? Gun control laws, famous example. The 1968 Gun Control Law Act. It's a federal law that's been in place for 50 years. It bans the importation of guns from overseas. It's against the law to import guns from overseas. So how is it that Glock, Ruger, and a variety of other European, Chinese, Israeli companies sell their weapons here in the United States?
They sell in parts.
They ship the parts to the United States because that's not against the law, and they assemble them here. There's a perfect example of a circumvention argument. California attempted to ban a variety of assault weapons in the early 1990s. They had a list. Here are 38 guns that you can't sell in California anymore. The manufacturers changed the names of all their guns. They're not on the list. So how can you get around it without breaking the law? That's a circumvention argument. Both of these, though, require some kind of attitudinal inherency. The source of the problem has to be that people don't want to change. They don't want to alter their behaviors. They want to continue doing whatever it is they're doing. Like on the death penalty, you're not going to find that. It's not like rogue wardens are going to surreptitiously execute prisoners. That's not going to happen. But people might continue to eat bad food for them, even though the fat taxes are being charged or something like that. Feasibility arguments. Sometimes people want to do things that we don't have the technology, the manpower, the resources to do. It's great to want to do something, but let's face it, you can't wave your magic wand and suddenly have the ability to do something just because you say you want that to be the case. I think it would be great if we could replace a variety of fossil fuels with solar and wind power. We can't quite do that yet. All right? We can't produce enough energy through solar power to replace all the fossil fuel uses that we have. We don't have enough solar panels. We don't have enough space. And it's going to cost a lot of money to do that. It's not like you can say, tomorrow let's get rid of those and let's just put in the other. It doesn't work that way. And the same thing with wind power. That doesn't mean that we won't technically find solutions to that, but it's going to take a while. Let's build a wall. Does anybody know what some of the problems with building the wall are that are feasibility issues?
Mexico doesn't want to pay.
Well, cost, that's a different issue. That's a disadvantage. How much it's going to cost us, that's a harmful equation. What's that?
Mexico doesn't want to pay.
Well, that's a cost issue too. If we don't have the money to do it, that's a different issue. I'm not sure cost is going to be the big issue. Do you know what the border between the United States and Mexico consists of for almost 1,200 miles? Some of it is mountains. Some of it is the Rio Grande River. And the Rio Grande River changes its pattern on a regular basis. Unless you're going to build a wall that's also going to serve as a dam, or that can move as the river moves, you got a problem. Putting a wall across the mountains, well, I guess they did it in China. We could probably figure out something like that, but technologically that's a little bit problematic. And by the way, some places, it's in the middle of the desert. I mean, there's nothing around for hundreds of miles. So you're going to have a wall there. I don't know if anybody's going to bother to climb over it, if there's anybody there to maintain it or watch it. That's some of the problems that you're talking about. Those are examples of feasibility issues. Not to pick on the engineers too much, but I've got another example for you. From the 1980s, some of you may have heard of the Strategic Defense Initiative. It is sometimes referred to as the Star Wars defense system. The original idea was that we would have particle beam weapons on satellites that would be able to shoot down ICBMs. The Defense Department was assured by a variety of engineers that we could build a particle beam weapon. $50 billion later, no particle beam weapon. So they've had to change. So we now have anti-missile missiles, basically. And the missiles aren't on satellites, they're on the ground. And we gotta do some coordination. And that's complicated, because it's technology. Then there are a variety of additional things that might come up. It's hard to tell what it is that's going to be a potential problem. Jurisdictional issues. California might think that they've legalized marijuana. If you decide to open your business selling pot, you've created a 10-acre pot farm up in Humboldt County. You're shipping your product down here to the local 7-Eleven heaven. Where you're going to sell it to people who come in, and you're taking in money hand over fist, and you think, what a great business model I have. That's fine as far as the state of California is concerned. But the FBI and the DEA might suddenly decide, you know what? That doesn't work for us. And they could come in and seize all of your assets, put you in prison for 50 years because California cannot change federal law. And those things are violations of federal law. That's a jurisdictional issue. Those kinds of things show up sometimes. Let me share with you a war story from when I was debating in college. It's my favorite story, and unfortunately, I'm not the hero in the story. I really wish I was. I'm the comic relief. So in 1977, my debate partner and I are debating a team from Wichita State. We're down at a tournament at Baylor University. I can't even remember what round it was. It was early in the tournament. And they were the affirmative, and they were arguing that we should have mandatory airbags in automobiles. This is 1977. There weren't any airbags in cars in 1977. So they were saying we should do that. Now I'm the first negative, so I'm thinking, okay, what do we have in the present system that addresses those issues? I've got a whole bunch of evidence on seat belts and safety issues and why we can do all these other things that we don't need airbags for, that sort of stuff. So I'm getting my arguments together. And while I'm doing that, they read their plan. And they read the plan, and it says, on February 31st, 1978, all new cars will be required to have driver and passenger side airbags, blah, 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 blah. And then they read some more. My partner pokes me in the side and says, did you hear that? I said, what? He says, their plan. What about it? It goes into effect February 31st. And I said, well, maybe it's a leap year. And he shoves me and says, wake up. Oh, yeah. Okay, go ahead. So I got up and made my arguments, and I sat down. The second affirmative got up and made their arguments, and they sat down. And then my partner got up. And he argued, argument number one, the affirmative plan will never go into effect. Subpoint A, their plan goes into effect February 31st, 1978. It says it right there. It's typed. February 31st, 1978. Subpoint B, for those of you who are not too quick on the uptake, there is no February 31st, 1978. In case you don't remember, 30 days has September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31 except February, which has 28. And then he looks over at me and says, and even in a leap year, only 29. I'm his partner, he's giving me crap. Subpoint C, without an effective date of legislation, the courts will not enforce the laws. And he had 10 court cases that proved that. We won the debate on that argument. The cheapest victory we ever had. I'm telling the story 40 years later, and like I said, I wish I was the hero, but it's just somebody paying attention to what somebody else said. Listen to what people are saying. Sometimes people say dumb stuff, and you can take advantage of that. They don't do that all the time, but if you don't listen to what the other side is saying, you might miss an opportunity. That's all I'm saying. All right. Mostly workability arguments chip away at the affirmative significance. Sometimes there aren't any workability arguments. Depending upon the topic that you're dealing with, there's not really a lot of workability arguments. We're going to lower the drinking age to 18. I don't know of any workability arguments that are going to apply to that. Instead, or in addition to, I should say, the other issue is what you need to be talking about, and those are disadvantages. Disadvantage arguments are counter-significance. They're a reason why we shouldn't be doing the affirmative policy. There's some negative consequence to doing the affirmative policy. The affirmative has their significance claim to say, this is why we need to put this policy into place. Common Core is making education more complicated, and it's hurting the ability of children to learn effective ways of solving problems. Well, the people who are advocates of Common Core, of course, had a completely different position on it. They think it's going to do something good. And if you get rid of Common Core, whatever good thing that it does disappears. To them, that's a disadvantage. All right. On the death penalty, the affirmative says the death penalty is bad because it's immoral, or that innocent people could be executed, or it costs a lot of money, any of those sorts of things. Is there a reason that we have a death penalty? There are a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is that there are a lot of people who believe that the death penalty deters crime. That punishment, like in all forms of criminal justice. Higher punishments increase the deterrent level of the particular crime. You're less likely, look, if it's $25 for driving while you're texting, you go, that's not a big deal, I'll take the risk on that. If it's, we confiscate your car, you might think twice about texting while you're driving. Well, the same thing applies to the death penalty. If the death penalty deters crime and you get rid of the death penalty, then we lose that deterrent effect, and that's a harm. That's a disadvantage. A disadvantage is a claim of future fact. You're saying if we do, just like the solvency argument is the affirmative claim of future fact, the negative is saying if you do the affirmative plan, this will be the consequence. This will be the outcome. This will be a harm. Disadvantages have to have 3 components to them. So when you're writing your disadvantage arguments, you should have 3 supporting points. You know, disadvantage number 1, eliminating access to assault rifles will decrease personal security. Getting rid of Common Core will decrease people's ability to function in the modern economic system. Lowering the drinking age will result in increased drunk driving. Increasing the military age of enlistment will result in an underprepared military. I'm trying to remember all the topics, you know, whatever they happen to be. You're going to make a claim. Well, first, you have to tell us how the affirmative policy produces that. What's the trigger? You know, and when we're talking about gun control, perhaps that's a little redundant. What is it the affirmative does that causes the harm? Sometimes it's easy to pick out. It's a direct effect. Sometimes it's a combination of things that produces an outcome. Right? But you have to explain what it is, what action the affirmative does that produces this particular harm. You then have to show that the harm is unique. It has to be related to the policy. Just like the affirmative significance has to be related to the inherency arguments, the negative disadvantage has to be related to the policy that the affirmative wants to put into place. Here's the simplest example I can think of to illustrate this. Let's suppose that the affirmative wants to legalize marijuana, and the negative wants to argue that marijuana use is dangerous. Okay? And they present several harms of marijuana use. Long-term loss of short-term memory, men growing breasts, amotivational syndrome, schizophrenia, increased risk of heart attacks, addiction, gateway use of other drugs, whatever they happen to have. Okay, so they've got a half dozen or so potential harms there. Let's assume for a moment those are true, and the affirmative is not going to deny those things. You could deny them as a response to it. Let's assume for a moment that you're not going to deny them. Are they true today when marijuana is illegal? Yeah. And tomorrow when we make marijuana legal, will they be true? Then why is that a reason not to legalize marijuana? There is a uniqueness argument. What is it?
Encourage them to use it.
There you go. Marijuana use today is 10 million people who are subjected to those risks. When we legalize it, there'll be 30 to 40 million people who are regularly smoking pot, and we are tripling and quadrupling the risk. That's what makes it unique. You have to show that the consequence occurs because of the plan, not because of the topic per se, but because of the plan, what they do. All right, and then a disadvantage has to have impact. It has to have some way that you can measure or weigh the harm compared to the affirmative significance claim. So like I said, the affirmative could have different kinds of quantification for their arguments. They could have a quantifiable significance claim or a qualitative claim. Disadvantages do the same thing. They could be quantifiable or qualitative. Like the marijuana topic I was just giving, that's a quantitative thing. We're going to have 4 times as many people suffering from this because of the increased use in marijuana. If you increase the minimum wage, we're going to lose 600,000 jobs. If we decrease military enlistment between the ages of 18 and 21, the military will be underprepared and will be at greater risk of war or attack by, unable to respond appropriately to terror attacks because we don't have people who are physically in their best shape to do those kinds of things. Those are the negative consequences of taking some action. And we have to be able to measure them against whatever the affirmative is talking about. So quantifiable or qualitative arguments. We're going to talk about value claims, but like I said, we're not going to get to those tonight. The sources of disadvantages are pretty straightforward. The first one are direct effects. If you're going to ban assault weapons, you should ban the pepper weapons too. Sorry. Not really. It's the first time I've tried that one. Are you going to compensate people whose assault weapons you are saying they have to surrender? Or are you just going to take it? If you're taking it, well, that's an economic value that you're taking away from people. People who have, they might have 4 or 5 weapons that would be classified as assault weapons, and they might have paid hundreds of dollars for each of those things. You're going to take $3,500 of value away from somebody. That's a pretty direct effect. We don't have the SAT topic in here, do we? Okay, in one of my classes, they're arguing we should get rid of the SAT exam, all right, for college admissions. My first question is, how many people are employed by the Educational Testing Service, which administers the SAT? Quite a few. And by the way, if you include people who teach SAT prep classes on a part-time basis, that's probably several 100,000. Ah, sorry, you're out of a job. That's a pretty direct effect. Costs are the most typical disadvantage arguments. If you're having a problem with your car and the solution is to buy a new car, what's the problem with buying a new car? Yeah, you got to pay for it. It's expensive. Even if you get an inexpensive new car, something in the $20,000 range, if you get it financed for 6 years, that means you're going to be paying about $500 a month for 72 months. Is that going to have any consequence on your life? $500 a month for 6 years? What are you going to have to give up as a consequence? Rent, eating, any social life. You might have to work more hours. By the way, how's that going to help you with your school? Having to work more hours to pay for a new car. Those are all examples of costs that come from making a decision. Now, then there's a question about whether or not the costs are greater than whatever benefit is. That's one of the things that people have to decide when they're choosing which policy to, which side of the policy to come down on. There are indirect effects, the unintended consequences of actions. It was discovered that DDT, which was a widely used pesticide, had carcinogenic properties to it, and so people were very worried about it. It was also discovered one of the unintended effects of using DDT was we nearly eliminated the American bald eagle, not because they were dying from DDT poisoning, but the DDT would get into the runoff on farms. The water would then contaminate the fish. The eagles would eat the fish, and what happened was the chemicals created a weakness in the eggshells of the eaglets. It was like a abortifact. It was like the day after pill for eagles. They'd lay the eggs, but the eggs would almost instantaneously break because they were weak. So we said, let's fix this problem. We'll ban DDT to fix the problem. Does anybody know what the unintended consequence of banning DDT has been?
20 million deaths from malaria. Because DDT has been the most effective defoliant against malaria, against mosquitoes that carry malaria. But it's not available anymore, which is why everybody has to live in a tent in some parts of the world. Have you seen some of those public service announcements? You know, make a donation, send a tent to Africa, that kind of stuff. I think we should send, you know, a 50-gallon drum of DDT. Your chances of getting cancer are much less than getting malaria. But that's an unintended nobody said, well, let's have malaria instead of cancer. That was just an unintended consequence. We have the terminally ill patients topic in here. Do we have physician-assisted suicide? An argument that I've heard, an unintended consequence of physician-assisted suicide is that the field of gerontology would probably disappear. Gerontology is the medical field studying the diseases of the elderly. If people who get sick opt out, then we don't have to worry about finding cures for Alzheimer's, alleviating Parkinson's, worrying about arthritis or osteoporosis in the elderly, because you know what? We got an answer for that. Take the red pill. Why would you spend your career in a field that's going to disappear because those people, you know, we're going to... That's an unintended consequence. And of course, values are probably a big source of disadvantages also. Oh, the prostitution topic. There we go. We haven't talked a lot about that. So the affirmative says that we should legalize prostitution. We'll make it safer for prostitutes, and we'll have the advantage that we'll be able to tax it and get some extra income. What do we call people who earn money from prostitutes? Pimps. There you go. The United States government becomes the world's largest pimp. I think there is something wrong with the government profiting off of the sexual enslavement of women. That seems to offend a value that a lot of people would see in this particular subject. And I think you could build an argument around that particular claim. All right, so there are lots of potential sources of disadvantages. You're probably going to have 2 or 3 disadvantages to present on any policy that's being proposed. They should be developed, they should have multiple supporting claims, and you need to have evidence on all of them. And use declarative sentences to identify them. Okay? All right, we're going to have to stop here because I want you to have a little bit of time to meet with your partners and resolve whatever issues we have to take care of. On Monday, we're going to do a quiz, quick-like. We're going to cover value issues. I'll walk you through a debate and answer a whole bunch of questions. And I'm going to try and give you some time at the end to meet again. Our first debates, though, are a week from tonight. The rest of the time is yours. If you want some help from me, wave your hand. I'm happy to come and give you some advice.
Could you flip back the proposition you put for us?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
So if it's 2 on 2, I'm not really understanding how it's going to work out. So if it's 2 on 2, and in this case it's going to be I want to raise the minimum age for retirement.
Here.
I mean for retirement.
Let's look at the assignment.
We get it done. Do you guys want to be?
There's a responsibility for each speaker. You're on the affirmative? Okay. You and your partner write a case together. You present the case. Your opponents argue against the case. Your partner defends the case against the arguments that were presented there. The second negative presents workability and disadvantage arguments. You in your first affirmative respond to those arguments. And then your partner at the end of the debate summarizes the argument for your side.
So am I sharing information with the opposing team?
It's not a bad idea to talk to them too. Look, it's not a competition. This is an academic experience. I mean, if we were doing competitive debate, maybe we wouldn't tell everybody everything. But in court, for example, prosecution has to tell the defense all of their evidence before trial. There's no surprise witnesses. There's no evidence that gets introduced that the defense didn't know was coming. It's a good idea to share information. You don't have to tell them the order that you're going to make and every piece of evidence that you've got, but it's a good idea to tell them, here's what our general reason for wanting to do this is, here's why we think the policy works this way, and here's what our plan's going to do.
So it's encouraged for a better grade.
Yeah, it makes for a better debate. The more people know about what's going on, the better the debate's going to be. All right? You're coming up to get that stuff that you didn't get at the beginning of the class? It's okay. Okay, yeah, you're worried about that. So, all right, let's see. I think I had a couple of quizzes.
When we just start, so we're on the same team.
Oh,
You guys want to share information together?
Did you guys already discuss
let me see if I could very well be.
So we're gonna we're gonna change from the state governments to federal law.
Oh, the federal government should modify traffic laws?
Yeah, we wanted to do it at least abroad of the whole country, not just the state.
I understand that. Here's the deal. Traffic laws are primarily state issues.
Oh, really? So all states have different ones?
Yeah. So, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't adopt a national standard. You could say the states should adopt a national standard to modify traffic laws to facilitate the development of autonomous cars.
I think that would be good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Instead of traffic laws, we do just general incentivization.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys want to write it differently, that's fine. Tell me what you want. I'm happy to go with what you want. I just tried to put something that would be so we know what the argument was. But write something up and give it to me, and I'll change it. Okay?
And the negative is going to be me, Alberto V, and Kyle. And the affirmative is
Nick and Alberto M will be on the affirmative. Okay. Again, put that on the note when you give me the topic so that I can make the change. I'm not going to remember that. All right. You guys doing okay?
Oh, we're doing good.
All right.
Because I mean, it might be complicated to explain what parts on the view. Hard to illustrate that, not using any pictures or graphics.
Well, you may not need to give, I mean, the negatives might make an argument about, What are you worried about? You could argue, for instance, that all that stuff is going to be aftermarket stuff, and that's a compliance argument that you can ban the manufacturers from doing that, but how are you going to keep people from modifying their weapons to become what they think are assault weapons? That's a workability argument.
You can argue that. I mean, semi-automatic weapon technology has been around for over 100 years.
Right.
And an assault rifle is literally just having certain components like an adjustable stock and a pistol grip and like a handle. I don't say that would affect the rate of fire on a weapon.
Well, that's a solvency argument
Yeah.
that says it wouldn't reduce the dangerousness of that. And if they're not banning semi-automatic weapons, then you're saying that their plan isn't going to make any difference. And if it's the other components that make a difference, and people who want to have those things can have them anyway, regardless of the ban, that's a different workability argument. So those are both solvency arguments that you could be making as the negative side.
As long as because we're good on grading it, so as long as you understand what we're representing.
Yeah, but everybody has to kind of understand what the argument is.
Right, well, argument-wise, but specific like parts on a